Hello, and welcome to whatever this ends up being. The meltdown at the nuclear power plant in Chernobyl in the mid-80s was significant in the story of the last chapter of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev himself even said that it was basically the beginning of the end of the whole thing. The conditions that made the meltdown were almost like tailor-focused to hit on the weak spots of the late Soviet system. Boss-pleasing, party posturing, being respected in the party being more important than being right, and doing the unpopular thing, in the party anyway, being more important than doing what is right. I'm sure many people watched the Chernobyl miniseries that happened last year, and there was this argument that Chernobyl was this example of everything that was wrong with the Soviet Union. Now, there's actually a very easy way you could push back against that. In many ways, only the Soviet Union could have mounted the response to the Chernobyl meltdown that the capitalist countries might not be able to. The Soviet Union was able to mobilize mass amounts of resources that many countries probably couldn't have, and given the huge ramifications of what could have happened, it's kind of a miracle that it did happen where it did. To give you an idea of just how bad it could be, imagine something like Chernobyl happening in America, where lots of resources would need to be mobilized in a very short amount of time. You could imagine that all those workers doomed to die would almost definitely not be white. And you could probably guess that private corporations don't have as much of a care about preserving the environment. The amount of market incentives that you could muster to try and encourage somebody to please not contaminate the water table for like half of the country or something like that is limited. I said on March 1st of 2020 that coronavirus was going to be the Chernobyl of the United States. I stated that because of American culture, politics, and systemic issues within the United States, that coronavirus was going to absolutely destroy the country. And I wasn't wrong. So let's get into it. Let's talk about why I'm calling coronavirus the Chernobyl of America. And I should start with a bit of a disclaimer. A few of the things I'm talking about in this video are unique to America, but many of them are not. Many countries are having trouble handling the coronavirus pandemic, and many of the things that are going wrong in America are happening there too. What I would argue is that neoliberal capitalism, and capitalism by default, is too unstable, it is too slow to react, it is too unable to mobilize mass resources in order to handle a disaster like a pandemic in any sort of fashion. The countries that are handling it best are usually doing so in spite of their dedication to neoliberal capitalism, not because of it. And if you look at some cases, the strength of a social safety net and the strength of their public institutions seems to be the thing that is getting them through it. A lot of other countries, my country included of Canada, have had to mobilize big public programs out of nowhere in order to keep the country from completely imploding. Now let's talk about all of the weak spots structurally in the United States that coronavirus hit like a laser-targeted missile. First, I think we should just go with the real obvious one, which is healthcare. America is one of the few countries that has a private healthcare service still. They have some programs from the 1960s, Medicare, Medicaid, but it only covers a certain percentage of the population, and a lot of working class people don't have access to it. The United States government, because of lobbyists, because of class interests of those who have power, basically don't listen to anybody who has less than a 7-figure bank account. Which means that a lot of the concerns of most Americans are pretty much not listened to. And healthcare would be one of them. Many countries already built healthcare systems. They're already strained by the pandemic, but they're not non-existent under the pandemic. America, if they were, serious about combating the coronavirus, the first thing they would do is put in a Medicare for all slapdash system, because that's what other countries are using to fight it. And a lot of the problems that are going to lead to the unchecked spread of coronavirus in America have to do with private healthcare. For example, let's talk about how the interests of the capitalist class are influencing the direction that the government is going and the decisions that they're making and how they are counter to an effective response to the pandemic. First, this one will probably get a lot more people on board, which is the whole thing with hydroxychloroquine. Hydroxychloroquine is a medicine that is primarily used by people suffering from lupus. And without regular access to hydroxychloroquine, they can be in pretty rough shape. They can even die. That being said, if there was a run on hydroxychloroquine, you could imagine that that would cause people with lupus to have issues getting access to the medicine they need. But nonetheless, right-wing leaders like Jair Bolsonaro, but most prominently Donald Trump, have touted the benefits of using hydroxychloroquine to manage the symptoms of the coronavirus. Problem though, that was based on extraordinarily preliminary science that has, in the months since this, turned out to be complete hokum. Doesn't work.
No way. Not this time.
And what was the motivation for Donald Trump pushing hydroxychloroquine? Well, it definitely wasn't a dedication to public health. His resident public health expert, whose name is Anthony Fauci, he doesn't even listen to. No, he got this when he was on the court playing golf with one of his friends who happens to also be a big player in the whole pharmaceuticals industry. And his friend, who is actually named Joe Pizza, convinced Donald Trump of all this hydroxychloroquine stuff with no evidence. And now, months later, when it's already been debunked, he's already pushing it. This causes multiple problems in managing the coronavirus outbreak. First of all, it makes a run on a medicine that people with a chronic illness require, which means that they're going to have trouble getting their medicine, which means that they're going to get flare-ups of their very dangerous condition, which means that there are going to be extra burdens on the healthcare service as their bodies are literally attacking themselves because lupus is an autoimmune disorder. On top of that, Trump supporters tend to lean towards authoritarianism. There's actually psychological studies that show that the number one thing that will make you support Donald Trump is a belief in authoritarianism. And so they're more likely to unquestioningly follow the leader. And when they do so, you end up with situations like where a woman and her husband both took what they thought was hydroxychloroquine or something similar to it. She got so sick, she was hospitalized for a very long time. Her husband died because what they basically were doing was ingesting fish tank cleaner. And overall, it does nothing. Actually, worse than nothing. Hydroxychloroquine has side effects that can cause serious health problems, especially for older people who are the primary victims of deaths from coronavirus. So they'll be taking it more often. Older people tend to support Trump more. Older people tend to have worse symptoms from coronavirus. And so they're more likely to take hydroxychloroquine, which can give them things like heart attacks. And that's obviously a huge problem. I don't think I need to explain that to you. The second point I want to talk about that shows that capital is taking the wheel more about how to handle this pandemic than, what would actually work for public health has to do with the coronavirus vaccine. Now, there's been a kind of inspiring effort of scientists around the world doing pretty intense work to try and develop a coronavirus vaccine, which is intense because this family of viruses has never had a successful vaccine before. Coronavirus is actually a cousin of the common cold, so this is like a big deal. And you can start to see the problems that come when capitalism and the development of a vaccine mesh into each other. There was a story a few weeks ago of the Russians. The story was like Russians hack into medical research files in order to steal secrets about the vaccine. And while the rest of the world was like, oh, that's horrible. How could that possibly happen? Oh my God, the Russians, they're at it again. I thought you were my friend. Tristan here is just going like, why is this stuff secret? Why aren't we just doing a global coordinated effort to try and develop a vaccine? And the answer has to do with capitalism, surprisingly. Who's developing this vaccine? Doctors. Where are they developing it? Public universities. But who is giving the grants for those researchers at public universities? Taxpayers. But also medical corporations. And part of that is that they have to sign NDAs to say that they will not share any secrets about how to make the vaccine so that when the vaccine is finished, the medical corporation can rake in some sweet profit. And it's going to be a lot of money. While many countries around the world, their governments are planning to make mass purchases of the vaccine in order to give it away to their populations, the United States is going down a bit of a different route. The way that it's looking, it's going to be completely privatized, the way that the vaccine is distributed in the United States, which all estimates seem to show is going to cost in the thousands of dollars. And you know that because of that, it's going to go towards the wealthy, which means that it's going to go towards men, it's going to go towards white people, and it's not going to be done in a fashion that is about prioritizing public health. There are going to be limited access to vaccines when they come out, and most countries are going to prioritize based on, public health needs, the people who are very sick, the people who are frontline workers and are exposed to the virus regularly, other vulnerable groups. And on top of that, they're going to, roll that out in some sort of way so that it maximizes the necessities for fighting the pandemic. But in America, it's probably going to go towards wealthy people. And I don't know if you know this, but nurses and frontline workers are not exactly the most wealthy people in America. And this isn't a partisan issue. I'm sure there are many Democrats watching this video who are going to say, well, all we need to do is win in November, and that won't happen by the time the vaccine comes out. But Joe Biden has already pledged that he's basically on board for the privatization of the coronavirus vaccine, which means that even if Joe Biden is president, there's going to be a vaccine. Capitalism reigns supreme in both political parties, and people will die because of it. Another structural flaw in America, besides having private healthcare, is that it doesn't have many protections for workers, especially when it comes to sick leave. Most countries have some form of paid sick leave. America does not, which means that many people who work in some of the most precarious jobs, especially a lot of those frontline essential workers, don't have access to any sick leave. So if they come down with the sickness, if they come down with coronavirus, they might not be able to take time off. Even if they're forced to, it might be unpaid. And if you study the precarity of a lot of American workers, they can't afford to do that, especially in the sort of hard times, the economic breakdown that the coronavirus has created. A lot of people are looking like they're going to get evicted next month. And even at the best of times, people still work through sickness when they really shouldn't. But the system's set up so that they really have no other choice. It's that or starve or go homeless. And even with that, coronavirus is a very nasty disease. It can be so debilitating that even people who can't afford to take time off work might have to. They might lose significant income, and they might even lose their jobs because of this. It's definitely not a recipe for getting good treatment for said illness, and oftentimes you need some very expensive in America things like intubation. But it also could result in homelessness, people being sent out into the street where it's very easy to spread coronavirus, or them having to move in with other family members where they are then exposing more people to coronavirus. And also, this is all going to affect people of color even more. A lot of frontline workers and essential workers are disproportionately people of color. And under capitalism, race and class are pretty much intertwined. Being a person of color is like a visual marker of class in many ways, and it's really impossible to intertwine them. So all the things that are going to disproportionately affect working class people are going to extra disproportionately affect people of color. So compared to white people, people of color have less access to jobs that even could transition to a work from home structure. And because they're paid less and put in less high-level jobs, people of color have less access to health insurance. When they're sick, they have less chance to take time off work. They have less access to proper health care, which means that they die in higher numbers than white people do when they do get sick, and they live in smaller homes that have more generations living in the same place, which means that coronavirus can spread a lot more within these homes. And this is something that's been going on for basically as long as there has been racism. Black wealth has been in significant decline, especially since the 2008 recession, to the point where by the 2050s, black wealth in America is expected to hit $0. And because of that precarity, black people are more vulnerable to a lot of different disasters that will disproportionately affect the spread of COVID-19. Looking at the amount of people per capita who have COVID-19, white people are significantly below average, while black people have 2.7 times more cases of COVID-19 per capita than white people. And Latinx people, it's actually 3.2 times more than white people. So racist and capitalist economies, which, I repeat myself, are significantly making the pandemic worse. In America, where white supremacy is a key part of the American economic structure, it's another thing that's going to make everything worse on top of the private healthcare. And I should mention a lot of the stuff I got on race, I got from a really great episode of Vanguard Army, which is a really amazing podcast you should listen to, with an interview with Andre Demise. I'm going to put a link in the description because it's a fucking amazing podcast. Another thing to mention is that the modern structure of the economy, just like the actual physical structure, is not good under capitalism for handling something like COVID-19. One thing that is very prevalent in our world today is something called just-in-time delivery, which is a logistics system where basically lots of warehouses are now empty because things just get to the frontline location, the stores and things like that, at just the time that they're needed through frequent smaller deliveries, which is fine if you're wanting to keep warehousing costs down, but during a shock to the system, like say panic buying or a run on a certain product, you end up with shocks to the system that really the economy can't manage. I'm sure people have noticed in small ways and big that the availability of products has changed. And that's expected to get worse, not better, as our supply lines become more and more strained. There's talks of meat shortages, there's talks of food shortages, there's talks of fuel shortages. And all of this has to do with because every part of that line is going to be affected by COVID-19. And because of that, one break in the chain, in a chain that's pulled so tight, there's no slack. And so one thing breaks, everything breaks down. It's efficient, but fragile.
So if you wonder where your weave or your fashion over packages have arrived, guess what? Coronavirus!
And the response to the economic disruptions caused by COVID-19 are being responded to with the tools that are in the neoliberal tool bag, which are deregulation, basically forcing conditions to be even less safe, and that is resulting in even more outbreaks. I just finished editing a video for Mexi, by the way, and you should definitely check out the video on speciesism and COVID-19. But one of the responses to the coronavirus is that the meat industry is speeding up the factory lines, which is a very dangerous thing in those places. And this is not just the meat industry, but in industries in general, speeding it up things will make things more disruptive. And so that makes things less safe. And during this crisis, they're exploiting it to get more deregulation under something what Naomi Klein coined in her book, the Shock Doctrine, which is that during these moments of crisis, the ideas that are lying around will be utilized and a lot of things can change in a very short amount of time. And right now, the COVID-19 crisis is being used to push a lot of deregulation, especially in the United States, where deregulation is a lot more common. The forcing open of schools is being used by, actually it's been happening in Ontario too, but it's being used by the Department of Education to backdoor push for more private education, as private schools will be safer. And on top of that, distance education is expensive, and so only private schools will be able to do it. So if you want your kids to be safe, you gotta start switching to private schools. And the more people who switch to private schools, the less money there is for public schools. And the less money there is for public schools, the less there can be, and to the point where they can basically work on the larger project of the right of privatizing education. Okay, so structural problems aside, let's talk about the political culture of the United States and how that has led to a worsening of the pandemic. I'm sure the number one thing that comes around is culture wars. American politics is very much driven by wedge issues, and Donald Trump especially is very adept at turning everything into a wedge issue, to the point where wearing masks became a wedge issue, doing anything about the coronavirus became a wedge issue, forcing open the economy, which led to a second massive spike in cases, is an issue. Like the amount of culture wars per day starting around COVID-19 is an effect of American politics, and it spills over into other countries' politics as well, mine included. And because the COVID-19 crisis happened during an election year, it's like doubly bad. Now, I'm not the kind of person who says that the problem is polarization. Politics is so polarized these days. We all live in filter bubbles. Both of those are generally wrong and fairly reductionist, so I'm not going to make that argument. That is not why we have these problems with political culture. I'm not gonna blame newfangled technology for it. What this is the natural result of the breakdown of neoliberal society. American politics has always been polarized. There was a brief moment in the 50s where there was sort of the Washington consensus, but that was a very short period of American history. Polarization is the norm. What is abnormal is that basically since the 1970s, America has been becoming more and more and more unequal. And ever since the 2008 recession especially, the entire economic structure of America is falling apart, and everybody is feeling way more precarious than they were a few years ago, which is driving attempts to blame what's going on, reactionary backlash to the backlash, and it is just generally making politics in America more unstable. We can try to blame Twitter or something, but trust me, there are bigger and more systemic culprits than Twitter. Also, the current president of the United States is much more authoritarian than a lot of other presidents have been, and that's saying something. And the right in America is extremely authoritarian in its disposition. Authoritarian regimes tend to be more focused on their public perception and appearance of displaying strength. This was one of the issues about the Chernobyl crisis, is that the USSR was not willing to ask for international help because that would make the USSR look weak. So therefore, they dealt with the crisis, and it was much, much worse because of it. And because Donald Trump and the Republican administration is pathologically obsessed with looking good in a crisis, the ability to respond to mistakes they made and the ability to deal with things in a way that it needs to be done, just, grassroots, no pride, no glory, just get shit done, can't happen because the administration's too obsessed with making sure that they display strength. And third, let's talk about culture, because there is some unique features of American culture that are leading to the spreading of the coronavirus. The big one that I'm sure surprises none of you is that American culture has a pretty unique predilection towards conspiracy theories. This is not just me, this is a common thing. It's been studied in American history for longer than I've been alive. There's a really famous book from the 60s called The Paranoid Style in American Politics that is pretty important to understanding that American culture is just full of reactionary conspiracy theories. My first video on Step Back was about it. But just to the top of my head, witch hunts, literal witch hunts, anti-Masonic groups in the 1800s, McCarthyism, the Satanic Panic, 9/11 truthers, the Obama birther movement, Pizzagate, QAnon, misinformation about masks, and anticipatory misinformation about vaccines, vaccine truthers, but also the idea that Bill Gates is going to plant RFIDs in everybody through his vaccine that has Jeffrey Epstein's DNA or some shit. And oftentimes, American conspiracy theories manifest as reactionary backlashes, usually against marginalized minorities in America. There's 5G and fear of the Chinese. There's the conspiracy theory that COVID-19 is a Chinese bioweapon. And both Trump and Biden are ramping up xenophobic attacks against China as a way to display strength during this whole crisis. And why is conspiracy theory culture so prevalent in America? Well, there is issues with media literacy in America. It's not really a priority in American education to learn about how to critically assess things that you see in media, especially in older generations. Older generations seem more likely to simply trust sources, even when they're of dubious sources, and then post them on Facebook for you to get in a fight in the comments with them on. There's the fact that for most of American history, there has been very little reason for anybody to trust the United States. Black people especially, where the government has been them over for as long as there has been in America. And when I was doing my American Studies Masters, I did study conspiracy theories as part of it. And conspiracy theories are very prevalent in the Black community in America, but also America did do a lot of conspiracy theories against Black people. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment comes to mind, where the United States just didn't treat a ton of Black Americans who had syphilis and let them die as part of a medical experiment of what just happened if Blacks got syphilis. There's this sort of paranoia of the Republic. It's this idea that, like in Rome was a republic that fell and led to tyranny. And so there's this idea that Americans have to constantly be on vigil looking for corruption in the Republic in wherever it shows up. And usually it shows up from people who are not from America, because it's always framed as xenophobia or racism, including anti-Masonic stuff, because the Masons were one of the few organizations that Jewish people could join. So yeah, if you want to know where that came from. And of course, conspiracy culture is advanced in America because of media that has a capitalist drive, and conspiracy theories generate clicks, and clicks generate money. So if you can advance conspiracy theories even slightly, you're going to find yourself in the dough. And the less ethics you have, the more dough there is to make. I hate to harp on American culture specifically, except that's what this video is about. But in my studies of American culture, there is this hyper-individualistic idea and this glorification of helping oneself at the expense of others. In America, individual billionaires are worshipped as paragons of virtue, and seeing each other as allies and being in this together is seen as weakness at best and potentially socialist at worst, which is bad because... And yeah, in the age of social media, it is possible for people to have a big platform and just say shit without any vetting whatsoever, which is a double-edged sword and leads to misinformation becoming much more widespread than during previous times, though not as much as some people would like to think. There's a lot of people who are using the problems in media, around filter bubbles and misinformation, as sort of this desire to go back to a day in which a small liberal centrist elite basically dictated from on high what political opinions were correct or incorrect. And that. But yeah, it also does have some negative side effects. All being said, the entire coronavirus pandemic has taught one extremely important lesson that I think we should all take away. We're all fundamentally very connected to each other. There's no such thing as a completely self-sufficient person. And during these periods of crisis, but really at all times, we need each other, and we need to stick together. When it comes to many of its institutions and the way it runs things, America should start growing up and move forward into the 20th century, and possibly even the 21st century, or like another rigid, stuck-to-ideology empire, like the Soviet Union. It will be relegated to the dustbin of history. Thank you very much for watching. This is a brand new YouTube channel, so it'd be great if you were to subscribe for more videos. I'm gonna be making one every week. And if you wanna help this channel move along, if you wanna help me pay rent and keep cats fed, you can go to patreon.com/stepbackhistory and sign up. They can see videos early. They're gonna get some behind the scenes stuff. I'm even thinking about doing some exclusive Patreon content, so keep up on that. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.